Picture this: a global economy where a single geographic region is producing nearly a quarter of all the manufactured goods in the entire world. When you hear that, you probably think of a modern industrial titan, right? Well, actually, this was the reality of the Indian subcontinent in the late 15th century, standing right on the eve of European maritime expansion. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely dismantle that persistent myth of an isolated, stagnant pre-colonial India. Because when you actually look at the historical record, it reveals a highly dynamic, politically complex civilization that literally functioned as the primary engine of the early modern global economy. So here is our roadmap for unpacking this vast civilization. We'll be looking at the geopolitical landscape, society and village governance, culture and intellectual exchange, the global trade engine, and finally, internal fragility and the arrival of Europeans. Let's dive right in. Part 1. The geopolitical landscape, the powers of 1500 CE. Now, you have to understand that the subcontinent is a massive ecological mosaic. Up in the north, you have the Indo-Gangetic Plain. It's sheltered by the Himalayas, incredibly fertile, and naturally supports massive, dense populations. But contrast that with the Deccan Plateau down south. This is a vast, rugged tableland of basalt hills and stony soils. And because of that harsh terrain, it really favored the rise of highly fortified, independent regional powers rather than one sweeping empire. So geography really did dictate political destiny here. And this diverse geography forged a really diverse political map. By the year 1500, the Lodi dynasty held the north, while the incredibly wealthy Bengal Sultanate dominated the east. The rugged center? That was fractured among the 5 Deccan sultanates. But the south was shielded by the Vijayanagara Empire. Under rulers like Krishnadevaraya, this southern shield was an absolute powerhouse. We're talking immense wealth, monumental architecture, and serious military might. Moving on to part 2, society and village governance, everyday life. Governance extended way beyond the glittering imperial courts. Right down to the grassroots level, they used something called the Iyengar system. It was a brilliantly decentralized network for villages. Just picture a local council managing vital resources under the shade of a massive banyan tree. You had the Reddy acting as the headman, the Karnam maintaining land registers on palm leaves, and the Nirgantiti physically regulating the flow of water through stone sluice gates to feed the rice paddies. It was incredibly well organized. And pre-colonial India wasn't just a monolith, it was a complex societal mosaic. While society across much of the subcontinent was standard patrilineal and patriarchal, the Malabar coast in Kerala was doing something entirely different. They operated under the Marumakatham system. This was a really unique matrilineal kinship structure. Descent and property were traced strictly through women, and family life centered around these gorgeous traditional wooden courtyard houses known as tarvados. Part 3. Culture and intellectual exchange, a synthesis of ideas. This whole era was basically a crucible of pluralistic ideas. Out in the temple courtyards and shrines, the Hindu Bhakti and Islamic Sufi devotional movements were actively interacting, weaving together a deeply rich composite culture. Meanwhile, inside the courts, Sanskrit intellectuals and Persian scholars were routinely exchanging ideas. And scientifically, the Kerala School of Astronomy and Mathematics was churning out world-class research. Scholars like Madhava and Nilakantha were pioneering complex mathematical concepts literally centuries before they appeared in Europe. And all of this intellectual wealth was propped up by immense material prosperity. Foreign travelers, everyone from the Persian ambassador Abdurrazzaq to the Portuguese writer Duarte Barbosa, they were universally awestruck. They constantly described it as a land of wonders, with bazaars just completely overflowing with fine cloths, diamonds, and precious metals. Which brings us to part 4, the global trade engine, at the center of commerce. The subcontinent wasn't merely exporting raw goods. No, it was a global manufacturing titan. Textiles and silks from hubs like Calicut and the massive Hampi bazaars were literally clothing the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Precious diamonds from Vijayanagara were making their way all the way to Europe. But crucially, the region absolutely dominated advanced metallurgy. At sites like Zawar, they had a 3,000-year-old legacy of zinc distillation and smelting. That's what fueled the global maritime trade in brass and other vital metals. So how do you manage a massive global economy like this? Well, it required some serious financial innovation. Enter the Hundi system. Rather than hauling heavy chests of gold across dangerous trade routes, a merchant would just deposit their funds with a local broker. A scribe would draft a contract using a reed pen on handmade paper, seal it with wax, and that was it. That single piece of paper could then be transported safely and exchanged for cash or goods in incredibly distant markets, a real game changer for international trade. Finally, Part 5, Internal Fragility and Arrival, the Winds of Change. Now we have to look at the whole picture. Historically, all this immense, glittering wealth was built upon deep social stratification. The imperial courts and the merchant classes relied heavily on agrarian surplus extraction. Basically, crushing tax burdens were placed squarely on the shoulders of the rural producing classes. This vast inequality, mixed with strict social hierarchies and frequent, violent political succession crises, like the devastating civil war in Hampi back in 1542, created intense internal fragility within these massive empires. And as these internal tensions were bubbling up, the global winds were shifting rapidly. In 1453, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople bottlenecked traditional Eurasian trade routes. This pushed an increasingly desperate Europe to seek direct sea access to the east. Fast forward to 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas splits global navigation rights, pushing Portugal eastward, and just 4 years later, in 1498, Vasco da Gama rounds the Cape of Good Hope and steps right into the fabulously wealthy court of the Zamorin in Calicut. Direct European commercial intervention had officially arrived. You often hear traditional histories frame this European arrival as a discovery that supposedly awakened a dormant, stagnant continent. But when we actually look at the complex societies, the advanced metallurgy, the highly decentralized governance, and those massive global trade networks we just explored, we have to ask ourselves, was 1498 truly the dawn of a new era? Or was it simply a desperate new player finally managing to tap into a prosperous, incredibly advanced engine that was already driving the early modern world? Something to think about.